everyone today. And please kindly type your questions in the chat box. We'll be we'll try and answer all those questions in the course or possibly in after the presentation. We'll see how it goes. And we're going to send a short evaluation survey, towards the end of the presentation. We'll please like for you to help us with that so we know how to serve you better, and we just want to go straight today into the webinar session. Our guest today is Dr. Annie Williams. She has taken time today amidst a very busy schedule, and we thank you for your time, to share this topic with us today. Dr. Anne Williams completed a PhD in mineral bioavailability and its impact on performance and health in ruminants. She's currently an independent mineral advisor. She consults for veterinarians, farmers, and livestock nutritionists. Dr. Annie, once again, thank you for joining us today, and we hand over to you right now.
Thanks, David. I'm just going to try and share my screen, make sure everyone can see it. Great. So yeah, thank you very much for that introduction. Yeah, I'm Annie. I cover minerals in ruminants, but I'm going to talk specifically today about sheep and goats. You'll notice from my accent that I am from the UK. So I work in the UK, but I also work across the US, giving advice to different farmers, vets, nutritionists in that market as well. So I always like to start with really understanding why minerals are important and why we need to make sure that we're balancing them correctly in the diet. So the way that I think about it is that minerals are like the oil in a car. Whereas the rest of the nutrition, we might think about energy and protein, and we might think about those as the fuel, and making sure that we're getting those balances is absolutely critical. If we run out of fuel, if we run out of energy and protein, we're going to notice that straight away. The animal is going to be impacted by that in a way that it stops performing, stops producing milk, stops growing, whatever it might be that we're chasing as our outcome in any situation. But if we get mineral balance wrong, that's like getting the oil in your car wrong. So although you might not notice it straight away, there will be impact either down the line of getting that wrong or potentially much further down the road in terms of if we're getting balance of those things wrong. So that could be mineral excess or it could be mineral insufficiency. And I'm going to talk about both of those things. So the reason why minerals are so important and why we see consequences in lots of different areas of health and performance is because minerals are involved in almost every process in the body. So almost everything that we're asking these sheep and goats to do, a mineral will be involved in that pathway at some point. So if we're asking them to grow, there's lots of enzymes that require minerals as part of their pathway. Even animals extracting energy and glucose from their diet, there's minerals involved in that pathway. So although the animal might take longer to respond to these imbalances, we can have severe detrimental effects on performance if we get it wrong. And one thing that I'm going to talk a lot about is this idea of balance. Quite often people ask me what is worse, if I supply too much mineral or if I don't supply enough. And both of those situations are bad. We want to avoid both of those. Which one is worse probably depends a little bit on the mineral that we're talking about, and therefore the likelihood in which we reach a toxic situation. If we don't supply enough mineral into the diet, we get a risk of deficiency. If we oversupply it, we get a risk of toxicity. So what we're aiming for is this kind of sweet spot. If only it was as simple as this curve on the slide, it's certainly not. But we're aiming for this idea of optimum, where we're meeting animal requirement, but we're not meeting it without significant excess. Now, how wide this curve is kind of depends a little bit on the mineral that we're talking about. So when we're talking about sheep, I'm going to talk a little bit later about some copper sensitivity. With that, we're talking quite narrow in terms of our curve. It's quite easy to send those animals into oversupply and risk of toxicity. But we also want to avoid the other end of the curve and that undersupply and risk of deficiency. But that for copper would be quite a narrow amount that we're trying to hit. For other minerals, if we take, for example, iodine, our curve would be much broader. So where we can meet requirement without risking toxicity, we would have a much less steep curve on that mineral. I'm going to talk a lot about balance because what I kind of always try to get across to people is oversupply may not have a detrimental effect on performance. It doesn't always, but it almost always costs us money. If we're supplying mineral we don't need to be, if we're adding supplementary mineral into the diet that doesn't need to be there, that is coming at a cost. And if we evaluated that and looked at whether we could take some of that mineral out, there's potentially cost saving to happen. But what I don't want to do is send people towards the other side of the curve and have a risk where we're undersupplying mineral into the diet, particularly at critical stages in the production cycle. So particularly where we're looking at around breeding or around hitting peak lactations, feeding lambs, feeding kids, that sort of thing. We want to make sure that we're getting that balance right in those situations, particularly. So this is a typical analysis that we would see for, say, forage, looking at different minerals that are present in that forage. Completely ignore the colours on this analysis. They don't mean anything. They're just how that forage compares to others that have been analysed in the lab that month. But what we're really looking for on these forage analysis is, does the diet meet animal requirement? So can we see that if we feed this forage and this forage alone, that animal is not going to have a shortfall of any of the critical key minerals within its diet? Once we've looked at that and we've assessed that, we're also looking at a secondary thing, and we're looking for antagonists. So we're looking for antagonists within that forage that may affect mineral absorption. One of the key antagonists we'd be looking for would be things like molybdenum and iron, which are going to start to antagonize copper, but also have an effect on some other minerals within that diet, things like manganese and zinc. And we're really looking for, again, coming back to that same word that I've used already, have we got a balance? Is that balance right? If it's not right, what are we going to do about it in terms of supplementation? So I just wanted to highlight here that when we're doing minerals, when we're trying to balance diets, essentially what we're looking for is a mineral gap. So we're looking for, what is the mineral that is being supplied by the diet? What does the animal require? And is there a gap or is there an excess? And where we've got on the sort of right-hand side of the slide, this idea of animal requirement, that animal requirement isn't static, it changes. So it depends where we are in the season, in the production cycle, what we're asking of that animal at the time as to what its requirement for mineral is. So, for example, some things that we might see seasonally change would be some of the trace minerals around breeding. So we might want to look at zinc, manganese, selenium more specifically at those times. Or we might want to look at, actually, our dietary supply has changed. We've gone from, say, grass to conserved forage or hay, and that has changed the amount of mineral that is available through the diet. I'll talk a little bit more about what we might see in terms of those seasonal changes later. But I think what is important to remember when we're assessing and when we're auditing on farm, that these aren't static situations. You know, they're changing. So when we're putting, for example, supplementation packages together, we have to remember that although we might audit, we do also need to think about what might change, and what might change in terms of that base diet and its supply, but also what might change in terms of how much that animal requires. And we never get the perfect situation, but we're always trying to optimize that and balance that diet as effectively as possible. So I'm just going to go over some specific minerals that I think are really important when we're considering sheep and goats, and just talk a little bit more in detail about what those minerals do, why they're important, and some of the things to look out for in terms of how we might be able to identify some issues that might be a result of some imbalances in these minerals. The first one I'm going to talk about is copper. Got to talk about copper first because it's my favorite. It's what my PhD's in. So copper is involved in over 300 key enzymes in the body. So coming back to that first analogy around the car and it being the oil, and if we get imbalances, we affect the overall performance of that vehicle. We're talking about exactly the same thing in ruminants. If we get imbalances in copper, it's involved in over 300 enzymes. So we're really starting to affect how that animal is able to perform, how it's able to grow, how it's able to produce milk, how it's able to have lambs or kids, what its response to diseases. All of these things are affected by its copper status. But what I really want to stress here is they're affected by its copper status if we have a shortfall of copper. So if we don't supply enough copper in the diet, they're also going to be affected if we oversupply. So we can have an oversupply of copper into diets where we're not effectively reaching the point where we're killing that animal, but we're still negatively impacting its performance, and we're certainly negatively impacting its fertility in those situations. So copper is probably a little bit different to some of the other minerals that I'm going to talk about, which is why we have to be really careful with it. So it's stored in the body, and those stores can build over time. That sounds like it should be a good thing because it sounds like we should have a reserve of copper there if necessary. And in that situation, it is. If we have a store of copper and then the animal suddenly has a period of time where the dietary supply is insufficient, it will utilize those stores. Great. That is absolutely what they've evolved to do. That's what we want them to do. However, when we domesticate them and we start to feed them different diets, what can happen is we can oversupply copper into those diets. The animal hasn't got the mechanism to control that, so it keeps storing more and more copper into its liver until we reach a point where we cause copper toxicity. So that liver reaches a saturation point, can't hold any more copper. If the animal goes through a period of a bit of high stress or something like that, the liver releases the copper, it releases that into the bloodstream, and we get basically copper crisis, where in a lot of cases, particularly some of these copper sensitive sheep, they will die in that situation. Goats are a little bit different because goats don't have the same sensitivity to copper as sheep do. So probably in goats, what we're looking out for a little bit more is low copper and its effects on goat performance, making sure that we're getting enough copper into those animals. That's why we struggle to use the same minerals in sheep as we do in goats, because of those differences in how those animals are metabolizing, accumulating, storing copper. The other really important thing to remember with copper is it is subject to significant antagonism. So where I showed you that forage analysis before, some of those antagonists are listed on that forage analysis, but we've got sulfur, molybdenum, and iron all playing a role. If they're high in the diet, they start to bind with that copper in the rumen or in the bloodstream. When they bind with it, they essentially make it unavailable to the animal. So although our copper is there sort of on paper, when we get analysis, we go, yep, copper, perfect, that's the right level. If we don't look at our antagonism within that diet, potentially that copper is there, but not available. So really important to look at how it's balanced within that. The other challenge with copper is testing for it. So I'm going to come on to a little bit later how we might go about doing a mineral audit and understanding whether we're supplying enough mineral in diets or not. But the challenge with copper is the animal homeostatically controls its copper status really well. So what it does is the animal ingests copper, that goes into the rumen, starts to go into the digestive tract. The animal absorbs it, it takes that copper and it puts it in the liver. From the liver, the animal releases copper in a certain amount every day to maintain its blood copper concentration. And it will do that as well as it possibly can to keep that blood copper concentration the same until we either reach a point where there is very little copper in the liver, i.e., it's totally run out of reserves, or that point that I talked about before, where we've got excessive copper in the liver and we're nearing toxicity. But until we reach those situations of deficiency or toxicity, we basically, when we blood test, because of that homeostatic control, our numbers will be about the same. We won't know how much copper is accumulated in the liver in that situation. And that can make it really challenging and mean it's that the only real way that we can really understand what's going on in a herd of animals in terms of their copper status is through liver testing and looking at liver copper concentrations to really truly understand what metabolism and accumulation we've got happening within those. We do get extreme cases where we see high copper in blood. So that the bloods on the right hand side of the slide are an example of some copper in bloods that are off a client, so they're anonymized. But that is, those indicate that we've got a copper issue there. Those bloods are way too high, and if we don't intervene with those animals, we'll start to see copper toxicity causing death in those situations, because we've reached a point where the bloods are telling us these animals are copper toxic. So the main message with copper is use with caution. Always check that you need it before supplementing it. But if you do need it, it will have critical negative effects if we don't supply it. But if we supply it in excess, we can have real negative effects on how those animals perform. And remember that there are differences in sensitivity towards copper between sheep and goats, with goats being much less sensitive to those higher levels.
Yeah, Dr. Annie, while you're still on copper,
Go for it.
there is a question in the chat box, and I like it that you're still on copper. I sent that to your chat box, but you want to please read it?
Well, I don't know whether I can see the chat while I'm. Oh, yes, I can.
That
So
question is
is
of
this what is
Christine.
the
Yes.
best animal to use to test the liver for copper, for example, a kid goat versus a cull doe? Yeah, that's a really interesting question, because so for example, in cattle, we'd quite often be looking to biopsy, and we'd be looking to biopsy those animals that are at the critical point in the production cycle where we think we might be able to identify where there's an issue. When we're talking sheep and goats, we're talking slightly different, because we're quite often looking for animals that have already died that we can then go and sample from. Now, what I would do in that situation is I would prefer to use an animal that has been with that group for as long as possible, being fed in the same way as the rest of the group for as long as possible. So quite often a cull doe would probably be more effective in telling us what's going on in the other animals, but with the caveat of we need to understand why she was culled in the first place, and could that have a nutritional effect. So could there be a reason for whatever she's culled for to be affecting her absorption of minerals, or how much diet she's been eating, or have we been feeding her something slightly different because we're trying to get her to eat when others aren't. Really trying to make sure we're, I guess, picking the animal that is most representative of the group, which can be challenging, but I think if you think about it, you can get to a place where that kind of makes sense.
Great. Two more questions before you go. One from Christine, just above the one you read. She's talking about multi-specific grazing.
So looking for some advice on offering mineral while I'm running, we're offering. Would sheep regulate copper enough to still offer it for the cattle? Essentially, no. Cattle and sheep are too different in terms of the way that they accumulate and metabolize copper. You'd be very risky, and I would really advise against trying to do the same mineral spec for a sheep as you would a cow. They're just too different. Quite often you'll see that feed for cattle is labeled not for sheep or for dairy cows only and things like that. The reason why they're labeled like that is because the requirements are so different. And probably one of the most common situations that I see of copper toxicity is people feeding cattle feed to sheep.
Mm.
Thinking, oh, it's only a month, I'll get away with it. And you just, yeah, you can't really. They need to be fed differently.
Yeah, last question before we finish on copper. What are some antidotes for copper toxicity?
Everyone always wants the antidote. Yeah, tricky. So what you can do is you can try and increase your antagonism in the diet. So you can try and increase your molybdenum, iron, sulfur. You can do that. Normally what the situation is, what we try and do is we try and remove as much copper out of the diet as possible, keep the animals in an environment where they won't be stressed, because if we think we're on the edge of copper toxicity, if we stress them, we can certainly get to copper toxicity in terms of its effect on killing animals a lot quicker. So what we would often do is just try and keep the diet as low in copper as we possibly can for as long as we possibly can until we can retest and see where the animals are at. There are certain situations where we try and add antagonists, but it's not that, it doesn't always be that effective. It's a tricky one. It's a situation we want to try and avoid rather than getting there and going, what are we going to do now?
Great, thank you.
Okay. So just coming on to selenium, which is the next one that I'm going to talk about. So another one that we would classify in the trace elements, so required in the diet at milligrams per kilogram dry matter, but still one of those that has really big effects if we don't supply enough. So vital for growth, improving muscle development, really important in correct liver function. And I think that part of it is probably sometimes underestimated. We really need our livers in our animals to be working at optimum. They're really the powerhouse of these animals, enabling them to use other things that we put into the diet, utilize their energy, utilize their protein, but also removing toxins from the body, making sure that we've got this antioxidant function, keeping these animals as well as we possibly can. Also important for the immune system and related to fertility as well. One of the really important things to remember when it comes to selenium is we're not just talking about females within a group of animals, we're also talking about males. So where we might look at testing and we might look at, say, ewes, for example, and say ewes are a little bit low in selenium, we need to check that our rams aren't as well. If the rams are, they will have a negative effect on the fertility of those animals, which can obviously massively affect our lambing percentages in a flock of animals. So important for ewe fertility related to egg production. So low selenium can result in poor conception and can cause early embryonic death if too low. So although selenium, definitely we want to be thinking about all year round because of all these reasons on the left, our liver function, antioxidants, immunity, we really, really want to focus on it when we're thinking about breeding and having fertile animals and getting these animals as productive as possible. If their selenium status isn't right, then we'll have difficulty at those times. The other thing to think about with selenium is its balance with vitamin E. So this antioxidant function that selenium has, vitamin E has a very similar function in the body. And what we want to do is making sure that we're supplying enough of both, so enough selenium, enough vitamin E to really get these animals working as much as possible and really optimize their antioxidant performance, their ability to remove toxins from the body. Iodine. So iodine is a really interesting mineral because when we get iodine imbalance, we can get quite obvious signs. So where we get obvious signs is where we've had low iodine during pregnancy of the animals. And then when those young animals are born, they essentially exhibit iodine deficiency. So their thyroid doesn't work properly, it doesn't work effectively. The animals are born, they're floppy, they're slow to get going, they've got nothing kick-starting them, essentially. And that's where we got an extreme iodine issue that happened during pregnancy. So the animal during pregnancy wasn't able to pass that iodine on to the young via the placenta. But we see exactly the same in older animals. The iodine is really important for the development of the thyroid gland, production of thyroid hormone, and thyroid hormones control energy metabolism. So if we don't have our iodine status correct, if it's too low, then those animals can't utilize energy. They can't utilize that thyroid like they should be able to. And we get animals that are not performing as well as they could be. Really important thing to get right, particularly in those pregnant animals. But one that I would give a little bit of warning is that we do see diets with excessive iodine in, and something to be really careful of, making sure that we're avoiding that situation, and we're not going really too high on our iodine levels. Cobalt. So cobalt's the last one that I'm going to talk about in detail, because cobalt's probably the biggest issue that I see, particularly in rapidly growing lambs. So the animal itself doesn't have a cobalt requirement because they're ruminants. One of the advantages that they have is microorganisms in the rumen. Those microorganisms take cobalt and they convert it to vitamin B12. Vitamin B12 is really important for efficient conversion of feed to glucose. So all that feed that we're putting in front of them, whether that's grass, whether that's hay, whether that's other forages, whether we're feeding them some concentrate, in order for them to really extract that starch, that energy out of the diet and convert it to glucose, we need vitamin B12 in that pathway. If we don't, we can see really stark results in terms of animals really not growing at the rates we're expecting them to. So they're not growing because they're not getting efficient conversion of energy from the diet. Ruminants are able to do this because of those microorganisms within the rumen. So they're able to convert cobalt to vitamin B12. One of the reasons that animal products are important within our diet is because we need vitamin B12. We can't convert cobalt like a ruminant can. So sheep are pretty susceptible to a cobalt deficiency. There's a couple of reasons why. One is because of the growth rates that we expect of lambs. So how quickly we expect them to put weight on, how efficiently we expect them to convert energy from their diet to glucose to growth, putting quite a lot of pressure on these young animals. The other reason is because the way that they have evolved is that the ewe passes cobalt from herself to the lamb during pregnancy. That lamb is then born with a certain amount of cobalt, a certain amount of vitamin B12. But as it starts to eat solid food on its own, so it stops drinking milk from the ewe, or it drinks less milk from the ewe, those cobalt stores in that lamb start to run out. If we don't have enough cobalt going into the diet, we kind of hit like divergent pathway where we're trying to grow that lamb really quickly. It's got a high requirement for energy, high requirement for cobalt, but we're not supplying enough into the diet. So we've got two kind of divergent objectives there, which is why we see big issues. The other reason that we think we see big issues in lambs is to do with parasites. So quite often, if we've got a cobalt deficiency, we will also see some issues with parasites. Perhaps it's a little bit chicken and egg. Perhaps those parasites are causing the flow of nutrients through the gastrointestinal tract to be quicker, and therefore the availability to absorb cobalt and vitamin B12 is less. Or perhaps because we had a low cobalt vitamin B12 status, the animal hasn't got as good a healthy immune system, which allows those parasites then to thrive in that environment. So really important to look if we have got a parasite issue to make sure our vitamin B12 status is adequate in those animals as well.
All right, Dr. Annie, before we move to the next slide, and I like this because it's engaging and we can engage with people as you're talking. Through question popped up. So can the cobalt growing, if you can read that because of time, I don't want to read for you. Three question from iPhone to everyone.
Oh, I've lost the chat again.
Oh, sorry. She was asking about selenium in selenium requirement or the level of selenium.
So I would not be looking at the level of selenium within a mineral. I would be looking at the level of selenium within the diet as a whole. So be looking at saying, what am I feeding these animals? Is it forage and concentrate and a mineral? Is it just forage and then I'm giving them a mineral? And what am I giving them overall? And does that meet their requirement? I mean, really avoiding this narrative that more is better, because it's not necessarily. We definitely don't want to oversupply, particularly if that's going to be expensive. But I'd also be considering the type of selenium that we're supplying. And there are slightly different rules in the US compared to the UK on the type of selenium that you can supply into diets. But that also has an effect in terms of if we're using a more bioavailable source, we should be able to use less of it because the animal should be able to utilize it more effectively. So, not a simple question of use more, use less. Look at what you're putting into your whole diet. What is the requirement of these animals? Do I meet it? And what is my best source to supply that?
Great, thank you. Do you have any recommendation for minerals that should be looked out for in milking goats?
Yeah, so lots. So milk and goats, yes, we need to think about these trace minerals that I've talked about. We also need to think about with milk and goats some of those macro requirements. So looking at calcium, phosphorus, magnesium, and the balances between some of those macros to get these goats to milk as well as they can. So I'll show a slide in a second of other minerals to consider. But milking goats, yeah, absolutely. We need to be thinking about these trace minerals because these trace minerals basically affect all animals. But certainly when we're asking an animal to produce milk, we're also really thinking about our macro mineral balance and providing an environment in which the animal can mobilize and utilize as much calcium as possible to produce milk. And there is lots of interactions that affect that for sure. That would take me way more than an hour, but yeah, lots. And I'd be looking at your macros first and then go on to your trace elements.
Great, thank you.
And I can see there's another one. Can the cobalt growing issue be a problem in goats as well? Yeah, absolutely. The cobalt growing issue can be an issue in all ruminants. I just think that we seem to see it in growing lambs a lot more. But maybe that's because we're looking for it a little bit more. I'm always wary of looking for something versus saying, oh, it's not there when actually we haven't looked for it. But yes, all ruminants could potentially be subject to a low cobalt status, affecting vitamin B12 status and having that impact on performance. We just tend to see it and measure it in lambs maybe more than others. Okay, so this is the slide that I was just talking about in terms of those other minerals to consider. And this sort of wheel is not meant to be scary. It's meant to just indicate that mineral nutrition is really complex, and trying to put it into this perspective, it is a balance. We're never going to get it perfect. If you look at all the interactions that are happening on that wheel, to say that we've absolutely balanced it perfectly when we're feeding a lot of forage is variable. We're never going to do that. What we're trying to do is balance it as effectively as we can do at those different critical points, and think about the animal that we're feeding and how we can balance it best. So some that I haven't gone into detail on that we still need to consider would be zinc, manganese. They're both trace elements required in milligrams per kilogram dry matter, but can have a massive effect on fertility, on immunity, on skin condition, certainly on things like udder health. We would see zinc having an effect, and also thinking about zinc in relation to hoof integrity and its effect on lameness, growing evidence in those areas, as well as linking it and trying to link it in with biotin. Those macro minerals that I just mentioned, so calcium, phosphorus, magnesium, all playing a role, certainly in terms of making sure that we're meeting requirement, but also looking at how we might best utilize those efficiently within the animal and really get as much performance as possible. Clearly, with magnesium, we've got massive seasonal differences. And magnesium is something to be aware of where we've got rapidly growing grass that is potentially low in magnesium. The animal needs a certain amount of magnesium every day. If we're not supplying that, we can have big effects on the nervous system and see things like what we'd refer to as tetany or staggers, which can be happen really quickly because that animal requires that to be available to it every day. Other things that maybe not talked about in too much detail would be looking at things like sodium and sulfur and its relationship with amino acids and amino acid requirements. And then, although not minerals, also taking into consideration vitamins A, D, and E, and particularly taking those vitamins into consideration again where we're talking about conserved forages. So where we might if we're mineral testing, say grass, and then we're making silage or we're making hay, that sort of thing, most of those minerals within that grass will be retained. And if we feed it at the start of the season versus the end of the season, your mineral profile is not really going to massively change in that time. Whereas with vitamins degrade. So where we're storing those forages, we might see a change from the start of the season to the end of the season because we've got some degradation within the forage and breakdown of those vitamins. That, coupled with the fact that conserved forages are often not that high in vitamins, can cause us problems, and really need to think about supplementation in that situation. We got a couple of questions on that.
Yeah, on magnesium from Saint there.
If you have a high level of magnesium in your well water, should that be a concern to its impact on other minerals? Should you use a water filter? Yeah, again, it depends on high calcium, add high magnesium in. It depends a little bit on how high is high, but also what I would be a little bit concerned about with any mineral being particularly high in water is palatability. If you've ever tried any of these minerals, don't know whether anyone has. I've tried plenty of them. A lot of them really taste quite unpleasant. And so if there's a lot of them in the water, that can put the animals off drinking, which, although it's obviously not a direct mineral effect, it does impact them in terms of their health. Because they're not drinking enough because the water's unpalatable. But yes, well water is actually a really good point, because as opposed to water coming off the mains where we shouldn't have any heavy contamination of anything, hopefully, well water can be really quite variable. in how much mineral it contains, depending on where you are, what the geography is, what the weather conditions are. So absolutely worth testing. And yes, if it's coming out particularly high in something, I would look at, if possible, depending on what mineral it is, trying to filter that and remove it in some way because of its effect on other minerals, but also because its effect on how that water tastes. Okay, so I've talked a little bit about variables as I've gone through, but I just wanted to highlight just a few that I think are really important to consider. So winter conserved forages, just going back to saying they might be have a different mineral profile to grazed grass, and they're certainly going to have a different vitamin profile. Thinking about our variables in terms of the production cycle of the animal. So, what does it need? Does requirement stay static? No, it doesn't. So, where are we in that production cycle? Are we in late pregnancy and lactation where we've got a point of high demand? Are we potentially at a point where the animal has a lower demand and therefore there may be slightly less consequence if we've got a bit of an imbalance? Seasonal differences, particularly around rapidly growing grass, but also around how forages can change. Having a little bit of chat with this about the weather earlier. We've just come out of a very dry period and now it's suddenly gone very wet. That absolutely will have an effect on the mineral profile of grasses. And can have an effect quite quickly, depending on whether we're talking about water soluble minerals or non-water soluble. So those seasonal effects are quite important, and also effects around breeding, fertility considerations, and making sure that they're hitting requirements of those really important points in the production cycle. So just to come on to mineral testing and diagnostics, I'm not going to go into this in too much detail, but this is what I spend a lot of my time doing in terms of consultancy, is what I call really trying to put the puzzle together. So really trying to look at all the data available to us and saying, have we optimized this diet in the best way we possibly can to get the most out of these animals and allow them to be as productive as possible? So some of the ways that we might sort of start to put this puzzle together are diet analysis, looking at animal performance data. Then once we've done that, we can start to go into a little bit more specifics around blood sampling and liver testing. I'm not going to go into those into masses of detail, but there are different options available and there are different tests that might be appropriate depending on what we're trying to balance for and what we're trying to really understand within a group of animals. I mentioned obviously before that for copper, liver testing is a much more useful test than bloods. That's not the case for every mineral. For some minerals, we can start to look at bloods to really give us a good picture. And there's also lots of research and work going on at the moment to look at things like, can we use milk samples to really give us a good picture of what's going on within a group of animals. So supplementation options, if we've gone through that process and we've identified that we do need to supplement, my real big message around supplementation, because people always want to know what should I do? What is the best option? And annoyingly, perhaps that answer is it depends. Because what we've really got to think about is what is the supplementation that suits your system. So there's no point if you're grazing animals, me telling you, give them compound feed. That would be the best way to supplement because that wouldn't be appropriate for the system that is on that farm. So there's lots of options. We can use in feed, we can use buckets, loose minerals in water, drenches, boluses. I have some that I prefer over others. But what I really want to do is make sure that the answer that we're going to give in terms of supplementation is practical and possible within that farming system. And whichever one we choose, it's going to be done as accurately as we can possibly do for that particular scenario. What I'm always trying to do is balance it and get it as close to what that animal requires as possible. So there are some things, for example, buckets, licks, loose minerals that I don't love because it's really, really difficult to control how much each individual animal will consume on those types of supplements. And we get some animals that absolutely love them and they've got their head in it all the time and they're consuming way in excess of requirement. We've got some that are perhaps lower down the hierarchy, or they just don't like the taste. They'd rather be off eating something else that will not be consuming enough. So if we possibly can, I would pick the solution that means that we can accurately supplement each individual within a group to their requirement as much as possible. But if that's not possible, I would pick what suits your system and try to, for example, if we're using buckets or licks, make sure that we've got enough of them out so animals aren't getting bullied out, and really thinking about our behavior and our social structure when we're thinking about how to put those things in place. For me, in terms of thinking about supplementation, we've got to think about whether it's effective. So effective supplementation is necessary. We would have done a mineral audit, we've checked status, we've done that piece of putting that puzzle together and really understanding, do I need to supply more mineral to these animals than I am currently through whatever diet I'm supplying them? Secondly, it fulfills animal requirement. So it's not getting to a point where we're not supplying enough mineral, but we're not reaching that other point on the curve where we're risking oversupply and potential toxicity. We're trying to hit that middle ground of optimum supply of those minerals, bearing in mind where the animal's at in terms of performance, but also where bearing in mind what potential antagonists we've got within that diet to fulfill animal requirement for that particular mineral. And thirdly, what we're trying to do always with minerals is create an optimal status which allows that animal to perform. So we're not holding it back in any way because those minerals aren't supplied in enough quantity within that diet. And I've just got 2 or 3 slides just to illustrate some of those things and what we really can achieve if we get effective mineral supplementation and we analyze it and we understand why we've supplied the mineral that we need to. So I've just picked out a few papers that there's no reason behind these papers. There could have been lots of different others. But this is, for example, selenium supplementation and looking at selenium supply into diets. And what we can see is in supplemented groups, they have increased estrus, fertility, lamb body weight at day 60, and daily weight gain of ewes postpartum. So we've really seen that if we optimize these animals in terms of their selenium status, they've responded in terms of the way that they perform. We can see very similar here if we look at cobalt. So this is treating ewes with different forms of cobalt and different doses of cobalt. And what we can see is we do get a birth weight response and a live weight change response, indicating that supplementation here has been effective because these animals have responded to it in terms of weight gain. And I won't go into this one, but we see similar when we look at zinc and its antioxidants and its ability in terms of supplementation of zinc into ewes and performance in growing lambs that come from those ewes. So really thinking of this as part of a cycle, and what we do to the ewe or the doe also affects the young in those animals, because a lot of these minerals cross the placenta and are vital to animals during development and once they're suckling and drinking milk. So thank you very much. I'm really happy to take any questions, and I've just popped my social media and email address on here as well. So anyone is very welcome to get in contact.
Great, thank you, Dr. Anna. That was very, very informative. Thank you so much. I'm not sure if we have any more questions, but there was some questions that were sent to me. And but before that, Dr. I'm not sure of the pronunciation, Dr. Tarser, if you want to please mute and possibly give you a comment while Dr. Annie is still here. Can you hear me, Dr.?
Yes, yes, yes,
Great,
sir.
great. Please, I'll give
Hello.
you 60 seconds.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for arranging this wonderful webinar session. I'm so happy. I'm Dr. Tasso Mohammed from Ethiopia. I'm working in Waldia University, which is found in the northern part of Ethiopia. So I'm happy with this nice webinar. So I would like to appreciate Dr. Anya for your nice presentation. Really, it's very important. It's very important. Now, today I'm working on sheep and goat. So I'm doing on genetic improvement. Actually, my profession is animal genetics and breeding. I did my PhD in India. What I would like to ask you a few questions. One is which, in Africa, particularly in Ethiopia, most of the sheep and goats are feed on natural pastures. They feed on grazing. Maybe those sheep, is they affected by mineral deficiency, or grazing is sufficient for those sheep which is entirely depend on grazing? One. Maybe another, in what proportion, maybe if there is blanket recommendation, what proportion of minerals, say calcium or cobalt, may include in the ration of sheep or goat, if there is any blanket recommendation?
Thank you, Dr.
And
Annie. Oh, you know
yeah,
that? Okay, one more, please, because of time.
okay. Maybe, and the last one is I want to collaborate with you, and I want to collaborate in research. So I think we are in touch, and we'll communicate. Okay.
All right. Dr. Hani, any thought on those two?
Yeah, so obviously animals that are grazing, it's probably unlikely that whatever they're grazing is perfectly balanced for mineral. It happens sometimes, but I'd say you're very lucky if that's the case. But how big an effect it will have depends on how much performance we're trying to get out of them effectively. The harder we push animals, the more we get them to perform, the more they will respond to a mineral imbalance and us correcting it. So they'll cope quite well for quite a long time, but then if we start to try and get more out of them, we might see issues. I think, what's the other question around cobalt and copper and how much we should be putting in? Copper,
Yeah.
it depends, because it depends on breed. I never want to say a number and stick to it, because it depends on how copper sensitive those particular animals are, but also what antagonists there are. For cobalt, I would be aiming for around 0.1 milligrams per kilogram dry matter, and saying that's the amount that we need in the diet in order to get those animals to perform as well as they can.
Great.
Yeah.
Dr. Tossa, you can reach me. I'm going to give you details of Dr. Annie on research collaboration. I will drop my email address after this before we round up. Dr. Annie, there were 3 questions I want us to take, please, on Famature. I think I can read those 3 and then we'll call it today. Thank you so much.
Cool. So can a copper deficiency cause pale famature scores if parasites are under control? Yeah, interesting one. I would say probably something that we don't absolutely fully understand. We know that copper is absolutely related to how an animal responds to its to any sort of challenge, whether that's a parasite, whether that's immune. So it's probably not going to help. And I would be looking that if we were in that situation to really understand what our copper status is and make sure that we're balancing it as much as possible. Could we say that it's solely to blame? Probably not. It's probably one of those situations that is complex, obviously Falmetra around anemia and that sort of thing related to our iron status, which is going to be related to our copper status. One that you probably want to try and unpick to really understand. I don't think we can solely blame it on that, but I'd want to correct it if that was the problem. What's the other one? My goats refuse my loose mineral when they're on pasture or hay, but go crazy for it when I rotate them into a brush and forest bed. What could be causing this? Yeah, and really interesting one. So I would ask whether the loose mineral's got sodium in it. Ruminants are quite good in terms of seeking sodium when there is not enough sodium in the diet. So perhaps if the pasture or hay is higher in sodium, and then when you turn them out they have lower access to other sodiums, perhaps they're seeking that loose mineral because they're actually seeking sodium, and they will really seek sodium if they're low in it. So that could be a potential answer. The other answer, I would say, we're still looking into why certain animals seek minerals and certain animals don't. Perhaps some evidence in certainly in sheep that they might go looking for a little bit of cobalt if they're not, but a developing area, and it's definitely something to look into in goats. But my first answer would be around, is there a sodium content to that loose mineral?
And I think that sodium is like a carrier for other minerals.
Yeah, quite often put into drive intake because they will seek it. Yeah.
Great. Next question from Patrick, and I love this. Please, Dr. Annie, take that.
Is there a commercial mineral that you'd recommend for a pasture-based producer that is just getting started and isn't ready to commit to this journey? I see the value, but need to manage resources until I get there. Yeah, absolutely. And actually, you know what? I'm not fully aware of everything that you can get on the market in the US. There will be lots of commercial mineral available. And in a lot of cases, they will be quite well balanced. So what I would say is seek some advice, get somebody to look at your particular situation, and highly likely, yes, they'll be able to find a commercial mineral off the shelf that will fit. It won't be, if we think about that complex purple wheel that I put up, it won't be absolutely optimum, but it will be good enough. And we have lots of people that are really successful feeding those. We definitely don't need to overcomplicate it and have everybody have a bespoke mineral.
Great. Last question from Susan.
I used to buy lamb maker blocks, which they love and devour, but recently went to a Candy Mag style loose mineral. They don't burn through it as fast. Yeah, so it's that. Yeah, so yeah, that's just indicating that some of these products have things put into them. So quite often with blocks and things, it's either going to be sodium driving intake or it's going to be molasses. They make it taste good to try and drive intake of those minerals, and which one it is kind of depends on the manufacturer and the way that they formulated. But yeah, what I'd always take into account with those is you can't control your intakes. You're just need to provide it in a way that gives the animals the best opportunity to take in whatever amount they're supposed to have.
Great. So, Dr. Annie, lastly, how often do you think one should test forage, to evaluate mineral status? Should it be once or twice a year? Because those are questions we get from our producers.
Ideally, I would like to see people testing for it twice a year. But I know that not everyone wants to do that, and for some people I'd be pleased if they just did it once, because certainly not everybody is even doing that. With conserved forages we can do less, because like I say, once we've conserved it, its mineral status shouldn't really change. Although the vitamin status will change, the mineral won't. When we're talking about grazing animals, we can see quite big differences depending on, I mean, we're seeing some crazy different weather happening at the moment that is way outside the ordinary and can massively affect the mineral status of grasses and things like that. So with those, I'd like people to sample a little bit more often, but I know I'm pushing my luck on that one.
Great. Well, thank you so much. We can continue to forever, Dr. Hani. Thank you so much. This has been very, very engaging. thank you. Please take a moment, like we said, to fill up the evaluation survey. We appreciate you so much for doing that, so we can know how to serve you better. Dr. Annie's details is on the screen. In case you need a follow-up, please send an email on hani@mineral/advice.com, and she'll be able to help, and can also consult her privately if you want to do that. Once again, thank you so much, Dr. Annie. We greatly appreciate your time today. Don't forget, we're going to send the link and the PDF to everyone that has joined and registered for a follow-up question. And enjoy the rest of the day and stay blessed. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye bye.